The courtroom felt colder that morning, not because of the marble, but because of what was about to happen. Every seat was taken. Every whisper carried the sound of waiting. Reporters sat shoulder to shoulder, cameras already humming, their lenses searching for the smallest flicker of drama. The air was heavy, the kind of heavy that lives right before a storm breaks. Then footsteps echoed through the long hall, slow and steady. Justice Coleman entered. His black robe trailed behind him like a shadow that owned the floor. His eyes were sharp, calm, almost calculating, as if he had already decided how this day would end. When he took his seat at the bench, silence fell so completely that even the hum of the lights seemed to stop. Across from him sat Representative Dana Cross. Her emerald blazer caught the light in a way that made her stand out against the grey room. Her notes were neatly stacked, marked with colored tabs. She didn't fidget. She didn't blink too much. She looked like someone who had already stood through bigger storms and wasn't afraid of thunder. The clerk lifted the gavel. All right. Everyone stood, cameras flashing. Coleman gave one small nod. Be seated. He leaned toward the microphone, his voice smooth but heavy with authority. Representative Cross, he said, you have requested to challenge this court's interpretation of its last ruling. I hope you understand this is not a classroom debate. A few polite laughs rippled from the back. Coleman smiled faintly, pleased with himself. Cross looked down at her notes, then looked up again. No smile, no tremor, only focus. The silence between them grew thick enough to touch. Coleman spoke again. It's not often that a member of Congress appears before us to question the highest court in the nation. That kind of confidence, he paused, letting the word linger, can be admirable or reckless. Pens scratched faster. Reporters leaned forward. Cross remained still, her expression unreadable. She had been underestimated before, by panels, by committees, by rooms full of men who assumed she would fold. Every time she had turned that doubt into fuel. Coleman adjusted his glasses and continued, his voice cooler now. I speak often about equality and integrity, Representative Cross, but tell me, where was your integrity when your own district's oversight committee questioned your office's spending? Should this court take lessons in ethics from someone still explaining her own accounts? Gasps filled the air. The question wasn't a question. It was an attack. Coleman sat back slightly, satisfied, his smirk returning. He wanted the cameras to catch her flinch, but she didn't. She sat still, breathing slowly, eyes calm and steady, like a lake just before dawn. He went on, twisting the knife. You're young, ambitious, loud. I can admire that. But history belongs to those who understand restraint, not rebellion. He turned slightly to the other justices. It's become common lately, politicians mistaking passion for principle. Light laughter flickered from the bench. Coleman smiled again. He thought he owned the room. He didn't notice the faint curve of Cross's lips, that small, almost smile that spoke not of amusement, but of memory. A smile that said, I've heard worse from men who mattered more. The clerk cleared his throat, ready to move on, but Cross raised her hand just slightly. Your Honor, she said, voice calm and polite. If I may respond. Coleman nodded easily, the sound of confidence dripping from his posture. By all means. The floor is yours. She adjusted the microphone. Her voice was quiet but clear. Thank you, she began, her eyes fixed on him. Because I think it's time we remember something. This court may interpret the law, but it does not own it. The shift in the air was instant. Coleman's face stiffened, not much, but enough. He wasn't expecting that tone, not fire, but ice. Cross leaned slightly forward. Since we're speaking of integrity, she said softly, perhaps we should hold every person in this room to the same standard, including those who interpret the law while ignoring it themselves. The chamber froze. Every reporter stopped writing. Coleman's hand twitched. His jaw tightened. But she didn't press further. Not yet. I didn't come here to debate politics, she continued, her voice calm but firm. I came here to remind this court that accountability doesn't stop at marble steps. It begins here. The silence that followed was deep enough to hear hearts beat. Coleman stared at her, his authority slipping by inches. Cross let the pause hang, owning it. Then she spoke again, steady as stone. When I walked into this chamber, I knew what to expect. You would test me. You would question why I'm here. You'd call it confidence, arrogance, or performance. Those are the words powerful men use when they don't expect to be challenged. Every syllable hit like a drum. You've worn that robe for decades, she said. And somewhere along the way, justice became less about fairness and more about justification. Justification for keeping the comfortable safe and the powerless waiting. A hush swept the gallery. Coleman shifted. Cross's eyes never left his. You talk about integrity, she said, but integrity isn't about how long someone has sat on the bench. It's about what they do while they're there. Coleman opened his mouth. Representative Cross, she lifted one hand slightly. Respectfully, Your Honor, I let you finish. Please extend the same courtesy. A few people in the press row smiled quietly. Cross stood. Her green blazer gleamed under the lights. Every eye followed her. Humiliation, she said slowly, only works when the target feels small. I don't, and I won't let this court treat accountability like it's optional. Coleman's fingers tightened on his papers. The gavel stayed still. Cross's tone softened again, and that made her words sharper. I didn't come here for a lecture. I came because people outside these walls still believe justice should mean something. They believe this place stands for them. I won't let them watch it turn into arrogance. The murmurs that moved through the crowd were different now. Admiration, not mockery. Power is fragile, she went on. It looks eternal until truth walks in. Truth doesn't shout. It doesn't threaten. It just stands there until the noise fades. She paused, letting the silence breathe. Coleman's stare hardened. Cross leaned forward, her voice low but cutting. You said I mistake passion for principle. Maybe what you call passion is courage, the kind that doesn't wear robes or hide behind precedent. The kind that looks power in the eye and says enough. The room inhaled all at once. Coleman exhaled, slow, uneasy. For a moment it looked like he might reply, but he didn't. Cross stood still, her silence heavier than his authority. Then she said, almost in a whisper, justice isn't about who sits higher. It's about who stands taller when the system tries to bend them. The words hung in the air like smoke. No one moved. Even the reporters forgot to write. Cross gathered her notes, calm and steady. The clerk hesitated to speak, unsure whether to end the hearing. Coleman sat motionless, his control gone. Cross looked up once more, her eyes meeting his. No anger, no gloat, just certainty. The kind of certainty that ends silence. Then the gavel fell. The sound echoed through the chamber, sharp and final. Every person in that room knew they hadn't just watched an argument. They had witnessed a turning point. Something inside the walls had shifted. Power had moved. Truth had spoken. And as Representative Dana Cross stepped away from the table, the people watching understood one thing clearly. This was only the beginning. Because outside those marble doors, the world was already waiting, and what came next would change everything. The cold morning air hit Representative Dana Cross as she stepped out of the courthouse, cameras flashing like lightning all around her. People called her name from behind the barricades. Some clapped, others just stared, unsure if they had witnessed bravery or rebellion. Reporters pushed forward, microphones stretched out like metal spears. Representative Cross, do you believe Justice Coleman should face investigation? Someone shouted. She paused on the steps, her green blazer gleaming in the pale light. Her voice, calm but firm, carried through the chaos. I believe the law belongs to the people. If the people start asking questions, that's called democracy. Then she turned and walked away, each step slow, deliberate, as if she could already feel the tremors spreading across the city. Within an hour, news networks cut into regular programming. Headlines crawled across the screens. Congresswoman Cross challenges High Court. Clips replayed the same moment again and again, her saying softly, "Justice isn't about who sits higher." Viewers couldn't stop watching. In living rooms and diners, on radios, in trucks and TVs, in hospital waiting rooms, her words filled the air. Some people felt pride. Others felt fear. Everyone felt something. By evening, opinion shows were on fire. Analysts argued, experts speculated, and hosts leaned into their microphones like storytellers. One said, "She crossed a line no one has dared to cross in decades." Another replied, "Maybe that's the line that needed crossing." In a quiet office high above the city, Justice Coleman watched the coverage in silence. The glow of the television reflected off his glasses. The same clip looped over and over, Cross standing tall, her voice calm, her eyes steady. He muted the sound, but the image stayed burned into the screen of his mind. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar. Not anger, not fear, just awareness. The cold realization that the robe he had always worn like armor now felt heavy, like it belonged to someone else. He switched off the screen and sat back, staring at the ceiling. The marble walls that had once given him comfort now felt like a cage of echoes. Across town, Dana Cross sat in her small office. The lights were dim. Her chief aide, Lena, stood at the door holding a stack of papers. "So you've been invited on 5 networks tonight," Lena said quietly. "They all want you to talk about what happened." Cross didn't look up. "Let them talk," she said softly. "I already did." She leaned back in her chair and stared at the binder on her desk, the same one she had closed in the courtroom. Its tabs still glowed with color, every mark a piece of truth she wasn't done telling yet. Outside her window, the city lights blinked like restless eyes. She knew the storm was only starting. By morning, crowds had gathered outside the Supreme Court building. They weren't angry mobs, but ordinary citizens, nurses, veterans, retired teachers, holding signs that said no justice above the law and truth belongs to everyone. The air buzzed with quiet determination. Television crews captured the scene from every angle. Commentators called it the awakening on marble steps. Social media exploded. Hashtags trended nationwide. Is Cross for truth? Is the people speak? Is justice for all? In homes across the country, older couples sat at kitchen tables talking about the speech. "She said what we've all been thinking," one man told his wife as they watched the replay for the 5th time. "Finally, someone's not afraid to tell them the truth." For many, it wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about finally being seen. Meanwhile, inside the court, tension grew like fog. Clerks whispered in hallways. Staff walked quickly, avoiding eye contact. Justice Coleman arrived early, his shoulders tight, his usual easy confidence replaced by a hard stillness. In a private conference room, the other justices gathered, the air thick with unease. One cleared his throat. "It's bad," he said simply. "Public trust numbers are dropping fast." Another whispered, "She didn't just challenge him. She challenged the institution." Coleman said nothing. He looked out the window at the crowd below, candles glowing like stars against the stone steps. For the first time, he felt what it was like to be on the other side of judgment. Back in her district, Dana Cross woke to hundreds of messages. Veterans, single mothers, small business owners, people she had never met, wrote to thank her. Some said she gave them hope. Others said she made them cry. One message caught her eye. It was from an elderly woman in Kansas. "I don't know much about courts or politics," the message read. "But when you said the law doesn't belong to the powerful, I believed you." "Don't stop." Cross read it twice, her throat tightening. She placed her hand over the message as if to protect it. Later that day, she walked into a small press briefing. The room was crowded, cameras flashing. "Representative Cross," a reporter called out, "some say your speech has created a constitutional crisis. Do you regret your words?" She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hides both exhaustion and resolve. "If asking for accountability is a crisis," she said, Then maybe it's time this country faced one. The room fell silent. Even the camera shutters seemed to pause. Then, slowly, people began to clap. Not the wild applause of rallies, but a quiet, heavy rhythm. Respect, not noise. As the days passed, the story grew. News anchors used words like historic and unprecedented. Newspapers printed side-by-side photos, Coleman's stern profile and Cross's calm gaze, under headlines like, "The Clash for the Soul of Justice." In the Capitol, senators whispered in corridors, wondering what to do next. Some defended Coleman, saying he was the guardian of the law. Others quietly supported Cross, calling her the voice of a forgotten public. Committees began reviewing judicial ethics rules. Talk of reform filled the air. Justice Coleman kept his distance. He stopped attending social events, stopped taking interviews. One afternoon he sat alone in his library, a single lamp throwing light across old books. He opened a folder on his desk. Financial disclosures, travel reports, all the paperwork that now haunted his name. He turned each page slowly. His hand trembled once, then steadied. He had spent his career believing that power protected him. Now power felt like glass in his hands, transparent, fragile, one crack away from breaking. He closed the folder, leaned back, and whispered to himself, maybe truth doesn't need permission to walk in. Across the city, in a modest diner where the coffee never stopped pouring, two truck drivers argued over the morning news. "She was brave," one said. The other replied, "She was reckless." The waitress refilled their cups and said quietly, "Doesn't matter." She made him listen. Around them, people nodded. The conversation was spreading. In shops, on buses, in small towns far from Washington. Dana Cross had done something few ever managed. She made the country feel like it mattered again. That night she appeared on a late-night talk show, not to debate but to explain. The host leaned forward. "What made you speak like that in front of the nation's highest court?" She looked at the camera, her voice gentle. "Because silence protects comfort. And I didn't come here to protect comfort. I came here to protect truth." The audience went still. The host, usually quick with jokes, simply nodded. Back in the court, Coleman watched the interview from his office. The television light flickered across his face. When she said the word truth, something in his chest tightened. For a long time he sat in the dark, thinking about the oath he had taken, the one that once felt sacred. Somewhere along the line it had become routine. He whispered, "Maybe she's right." But the words disappeared into the empty room. The next morning, a storm of headlines broke. Investigative journalists released reports about years of unreported travel, gifts, and undisclosed meetings tied to Justice Coleman's past cases. The evidence was detailed, undeniable. Every network showed charts, timelines, documents. The once untouchable judge now faced questions he could no longer deflect. Outside his home, cameras gathered. Microphones waited. But Coleman stayed inside, curtains drawn, his silence saying more than any statement could. In Congress, calls for reform grew louder. Dana Cross didn't gloat. She didn't appear on every show. She simply said, "This is not about one man. It's about every door that ever closed on someone because justice forgot their name." Her words spread faster than headlines. People printed them on signs, shared them online, wrote them on sidewalks in chalk. It became a movement, quiet, steady, unstoppable. One evening, Coleman's longtime friend and fellow justice visited him. "You have to speak," the friend said softly. "The public deserves to hear from you." Coleman looked up, tired eyes meeting his friend's. "And what should I say?" The other man hesitated. "Say something true." Coleman closed his eyes. The truth was heavy, but silence was heavier. The next morning, to everyone's surprise, Justice Coleman appeared on the steps of the Supreme Court. The crowd was enormous. News crews broadcast live. The air was cold and bright. Coleman walked slowly to the microphones. He didn't bring notes. He didn't bring staff. His voice, when it came, was steady but stripped of its usual weight. "For years," he said, I believed that power and wisdom were the same thing. I was wrong. Justice is not ownership, it's stewardship. And stewardship demands humility. A murmur spread through the crowd. He looked directly into the cameras. No institution should fear accountability, not even this one. Then he stepped back, nodding once, and walked away. Inside her office, Dana Cross watched the live feed. She didn't smile. She just whispered, "He finally heard." Outside, the crowd began to chant softly. Not her name, not his, but one word that echoed across the plaza. Justice. That night, the country felt different. In small towns and big cities, people talked about fairness, about truth, about courage. It wasn't the noise of outrage anymore. It was the quiet sound of awareness, the kind that doesn't fade when the cameras turn off. Dana Cross sat by her window, the city lights shimmering below. Her aide entered with fresh papers, proposals for ethics reform, letters of support, requests for interviews. "What's next?" the aide asked. Cross looked out at the skyline, thinking of all the people who had written, all the faces in the crowd. "What's next?" she said softly, "is to keep going." Outside, wind swept down the empty streets, carrying whispers of the day's events. Somewhere far away, an old woman watching the news smiled to herself and said, "Maybe things can change after all." In that quiet moment, as the city settled into the night, two truths stood firm, one spoken by a man who had once held all the power, and one carried by a woman who dared to challenge it. Together they had cracked open something that had been sealed for too long, but deep inside the walls of power, where silence still ruled and secrets still waited, another story was beginning to stir. Because truth, once awakened, never goes back to sleep. And by dawn, the next chapter of the fight for justice would already be unfolding. The city woke up to headlines that didn't sound like the usual noise. They sounded like a heartbeat, a new day for accountability. Truth awakens on the marble steps. Cross and Coleman changed the conversation. Across America, people were talking about fairness again, not as a dream, but as something that could be built. Coffee shops buzzed with it. Barbershops debated it. At bus stops, strangers talked about honesty and power, as if those words finally meant something again. It wasn't a movement driven by slogans or politicians. It was something quieter and deeper, people realizing that truth could belong to them too. In her small Washington office, Representative Dana Cross sat at her desk, a cup of coffee cooling beside her. She hadn't slept much. The past few days had been a blur of interviews, hearings and letters from citizens she'd never met. Her aide Lena walked in with a stack of envelopes. "More mail," she said softly. "Hundreds, maybe thousands." Cross smiled faintly. "Every one of those letters means someone still believes." She opened the first envelope carefully. Inside was a handwritten note from a man in Ohio. "I worked at a factory for 40 years, it read, and I stopped believing anyone in Washington cared. But when you stood there and told that judge enough was enough, I cried. Thank you for remembering us." Cross folded the letter slowly, pressing her hand against it. "This is why we started," she whispered. Across town, Justice Coleman sat in his chambers, staring at the morning light spilling across his desk. He had spent decades walking into this room with pride. Now he entered it with reflection. The shelves around him were filled with law books, each one representing decisions that had shaped lives both seen and unseen. For the first time, he felt the weight of those unseen ones. The clerk entered quietly. "Sir, reporters are requesting a statement about your recent remarks." Coleman nodded but didn't answer right away. He looked down at the fountain pen resting beside his notes. "Tell them," he said finally, "that justice is learning to listen again." The clerk blinked, unsure what that meant, but wrote it down. Later that morning, the Supreme Court plaza filled once more. But this time there were no chants, no shouting. People came just to stand. Teachers, veterans, students, parents, all gathered in quiet solidarity. They weren't protesting. They were witnessing. Cameras captured the calm, the stillness, the feeling that maybe, just maybe, the country was turning a page. Dana Cross walked up the steps, the same steps where she had once faced down the nation's most powerful judge. She paused halfway, breathing in the cold morning air. Her aide whispered, "They're waiting for you." Cross nodded. "Let's give them something worth waiting for." When she reached the podium, the cameras flashed, but she didn't flinch. She looked out over the crowd, her voice steady and warm. "A few days ago," she said, "I stood in this very spot and spoke about accountability. But accountability isn't revenge. It's repair. It's how we fix what's broken without destroying what's sacred." The crowd listened, silent and focused. "We live in a time when people feel invisible," she continued. "But I want you to know something. You are not invisible. You're the heartbeat of this democracy." Her words rolled across the plaza like soft thunder. People began to nod, some wiping away quiet tears. "Justice," she said, "doesn't wear a robe or sit behind a bench. Justice is every person who dares to tell the truth when it's easier to stay silent." Inside the building, Coleman stood behind a curtain, watching the speech on a small monitor. Her voice carried through the marble like wind through old trees. He closed his eyes. The sound didn't feel like opposition anymore. It felt like renewal. When she finished speaking, the crowd erupted into a slow, unified clap that grew louder with every passing second. Coleman stepped out from behind the curtain. For a moment, their eyes met through the distance, separated by steps and history. He nodded once, a small gesture of acknowledgement, and then turned back toward the corridor. That night, news networks called it the day the bench blinked. Analysts replayed the moment again and again. Coleman's nod, Cross's calm smile, the sea of people standing together. But beyond the headlines, something quieter was happening. Donations poured into civic programs and legal aid funds. Law schools began teaching new ethics seminars. Ordinary people were volunteering at community centers, saying, if they can change the system, maybe we can help too. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't fast. But it was real. Meanwhile, inside his office, Coleman drafted a letter. The words came slowly, heavy but clear. "To the people I serve," he wrote, "justice is not mine, it is ours. And I have learned that power means nothing if it forgets to listen." He signed his name, sealed the envelope, and handed it to his clerk. "Make sure every courthouse in this country receives a copy." The clerk nodded, eyes wide. Coleman exhaled and looked out the window. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace with the truth. Weeks passed. Congress announced a bipartisan plan for judicial transparency. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. The hearings were calm, serious, focused on rebuilding trust. Coleman testified, answering every question with clarity. When asked why he chose to cooperate, he said, "Because no one, not even a judge, stands above the people who grant the power." The chamber, once divided, applauded softly. Dana Cross sat in the front row, listening. When he stepped down, he walked past her and paused. "You were right," he said quietly. "Truth doesn't shout," she smiled faintly. "It just waits for someone to hear it." Afterward, outside the Capitol, the sky burned orange with sunset. Cross stood alone for a moment, watching the light fade. Her aide joined her, holding a phone. "You've been invited to speak at the National Forum on Justice next week." Cross shook her head gently. "Not yet. Let's give the people their voice first." "What do you mean?" her aide asked. Cross turned, her eyes soft but sure. "It's their turn to talk now. Let's listen." Over the next few months, the country settled into a new rhythm. The shouting on television began to quiet. Debates grew less about who was winning and more about what was right. The word accountability stopped sounding like an attack and started sounding like healing. People began to trust again, not because everything was fixed, but because someone had finally admitted it wasn't. In a small town in Alabama, a retired teacher wrote in her journal, "For years I told my students that truth is a whisper, not a roar. Now I know what that means. In New York, a group of law students started a project called the Cross Initiative, dedicated to teaching ethics and fairness in public service. In California, a mural appeared overnight on a courthouse wall, two silhouettes standing across from each other, one in a robe, one in a blazer, their hands reaching toward a single word painted in gold: justice. Coleman visited that mural quietly one afternoon. No cameras, no speeches. He stood before it, tracing the word with his eyes. A young boy recognized him and hesitated before asking, "Are you the judge from TV?" Coleman smiled softly. "I used to be," he said. "Now I'm just someone learning." The boy nodded, not fully understanding, but sensing something important. "My mom says what you did was brave," the boy said. Coleman looked at him kindly. "It wasn't brave. It was overdue." That evening he sat down at his desk and began writing again, this time not for the public but for himself. "Dear future judge," he wrote, "when you wear that robe, remember it's not a shield. It's a reminder. You serve people who may never know your name, but they will feel your decisions for the rest of their lives. Do not mistake silence for respect or obedience for trust. Speak less, listen more, and never forget that justice belongs to them, not to you." At the same time, across town, Dana Cross prepared for a town hall in her district. The auditorium was full, not with politicians or lobbyists, but with ordinary people. She walked to the microphone and smiled at the crowd. "I've been asked many times what it felt like to stand there that day," she began. "The truth is, it didn't feel like courage. It felt like duty. It felt like finally saying out loud what so many of you had been whispering for years." She paused, her eyes scanning the room. "We can't rebuild this country by shouting at each other. We rebuild it by standing together, even when it's uncomfortable, especially then." The audience rose to their feet. Some clapped, some cried, and in that moment, the story that had started in a cold marble chamber became something larger, a promise between the powerful and the people that truth would always find its way back. As months turned into a year, both Cross and Coleman moved quietly out of the spotlight. Coleman retired from the bench, choosing to teach instead. His lectures weren't about power, but about humility. "The law," he would tell his students, "isn't stone. It's clay, and it's our job to shape it carefully, so it doesn't break the hands that built it." Cross continued her work in Congress, focusing on education and justice reform. She didn't seek fame, though it found her anyway. When asked how she wanted to be remembered, she said, "As someone who listened when it mattered." Years later, people would still talk about that winter morning, the day one voice cracked the silence of marble walls and made the world remember what justice sounds like. Books would be written, documentaries filmed, speeches made, but those who had been there would always describe it the same way. It wasn't the loudness that made history. It was the calm, the certainty, the courage that spoke softly and still shook the earth. And in the quiet moments when Dana Cross walked alone past the courthouse steps, she would sometimes stop just for a second and listen to the wind move through the stone columns. In that sound, she could still hear it, the echo of that first gavel, the heartbeat of truth refusing to die. Because once truth wakes up, it doesn't go back to sleep. It waits, it watches, and it reminds everyone who listens that justice, no matter how late it arrives, always finds its way home. And that was the moment the world finally listened. A story that began in silence ended in truth. Justice Coleman and Representative Dana Cross walked two very different paths. But in the end, both learned the same lesson. Power fades, but honesty echoes forever. If this story touched you, if it made you think or made you feel that truth still matters, don't let it stop here. Share this moment. Let someone else remember that courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it simply stands tall. Before you go, make sure to like this video so more people can hear stories that still matter. And if you believe that truth deserves a voice, subscribe to the channel. Because here, we tell stories that remind us who we are. and who we can still become. Thank you for watching, and until next time, keep listening for the quiet voice of justice